Hi everyone, my name is Zoe Sims and I'm the First Nations Impact Specialist here at Koskela. And earlier today I had a yarn with Darug author and playwright Julie Janson, where we talked about her novel Benevolence and experiences as a First Nations woman. But before we head over to the interview, I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge country. Today and every day, I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather. And for me, that is the Morgul people of the Darug Nation. I would also like to extend this acknowledgement and respect to elders past, present, and emerging, and also acknowledge those First Nations viewers tuning in today. Thank you. I often don't read First Nations books because I find it so emotional.
Yeah. Yeah.
But this one I did, and obviously no regrets. It's just so great. And to have a lot of Darug perspective and specifically out this area, I feel is so important because a lot of our Aboriginal histories don't really touch on Darug that much. So to have it in that much detail, and because I live near it, it was so good for me to read. So thank you for that.
There's a fabulous book called The People of the River by Grace Karskens, which has just come out recently, which is a history book. It's very readable. And it's and she worked quite closely with some Darug descendants out there, the Fosters, I think they're called their names. Anyway, and her book is a piece of genius. Took her 10 years to write. And it's all the material I used for Benevolence, but she's a history professor.
Yeah.
It's done in great deal of reference detail. So the two go together really well. I mean, she's a friend of mine now. I've met her a couple of times. But yeah, Grace Karskens.
Grace Karskens. I will write that down. Yeah, because I studied a Bachelor of Ancient History. So when I was reading the book, I was picking up on it's a really interesting. I describe it to friends and those that I recommend reading it as faction. Like you're going through a story, but a lot of it is based on the dark truths of what's happened in this country. So I picked up on those notes of what was going on. Like one thing that I was really intrigued by was when you mentioned about massacres in Emu Plains. So I literally live across the road from Emu Plains and always have, but I've never once heard anyone describe that happening there. So I was really shocked and saddened, but also intrigued to learn more and find out what actually has gone on in the
Grace's book is the place to do that because I write historical fiction.
Yeah.
There's going to be a play of the untrue and the true together. Which is part of, some people would say, the problem about historical fiction. But anyway, that's the genre. So that's the genre that us historical fiction writers work in. But Grace's book will give you the absolute details. So if people are kind of saying to you, oh, that didn't happen, you can refer to Grace's book. And it's in paperback. It's not even expensive. It's like $25 or something. And give the absolute detailed reference of the historical reference.
Yeah. And so what country are you coming to us?
Well, I've moved to Yuin country, Yuin Brinja, down the south coast in Maruya. A beautiful country here. I mean, as you get older, sometimes the city becomes too much. And I was living on the northern beaches, which just really became too much about 20 years ago. For me, I never felt really at home. There's hardly any. Well, no, there are Aboriginal people there who have come from all over, but very few of the original. There's a few descendants of people like Bungaree, who and part of my family connection through marriage is Chief Bungaree, through my great aunt. She was married my great uncle, and she was of Aboriginal descent through Chief Bungaree, who was her great grandfather. So I'm connected to that family, and I know other people who are direct descendants where I used to live. But I'm on Yuin country here. It's beautiful. Yeah.
Mm. Are you in lockdown as well of some sorts?
Yeah, whole of New South Wales is now. I just went to the coffee shop and I'd forgotten my mask, and I'm like,
oh no.
So my husband had to put a dirty hanky over his face in order to go in and get the coffee. So it was a bit embarrassing, really. I think the thing is never go out without a mask in your pocket.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. No, I'm the same with the city. I find I'm always in view of the mountains, and I find that is super comforting, and just being by the river always, and just having that location, especially now during lockdown where we can't really go anywhere. It's such a saving grace and really, really comforting.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, it's my country too, as you know, and it's magic. Our dad used to take us to the Hawkesbury River all the time. He'd just hire a little rowboat. We didn't have any money, so he'd row up the river, and sometimes there'd be a storm. And the Hawkesbury River, where we get a rowboat somewhere like Palm Beach. And it's, it's right near the ocean there. I mean, Broken Bay can get waves that are 14 feet high, I mean, it can be quite dangerous. And a big squall had come up and Dad had, he's very muscly, dark man. He'd be rowing like crazy to get us back to the wharf before we were all blown away, but we'd go and go fishing and go camping along the river. We love that river. Yeah.
Me too. It's crazy to see how it's changed since the floods. I went down there, so much of like the gorge, all the way from the Burrubarungal side through to almost the Gundagara side, because I kind of go to all of it.
Yeah.
It's the force of the water, like
Yes.
so many big trees that are all pushed, and it's still like that. It's quite crazy and remarkable with that whole flood.
Well, it's always flooded, I mean, since, whatever, hundreds of thousands of years, most probably. But the earliest records, the big floods in kind of 1804 and 1810, there's always floods on that river. You really can't build a house right at the edge of that river. It's really stupid.
So I do have a couple questions. I was just mainly hoping to have a chat, but I thought I better stay on task because otherwise I will just keep yarning. So my first question for you was kind of what inspired you to become an author?
Well, that's an interesting question. I never saw it. I seem to have my husband in the corner of my image here, but sorry about that. They do tend to hang around. I didn't really see myself as a writer. When I was young, I wrote a lot of poetry. Often young women do that, and I stopped writing it. My dad died in a horrible car accident when I was 17, and I wrote a long poem for him when he died. And it was such a catastrophic experience for me. I was really close to my dad. I was the only girl in the family. I have two brothers, one older and one younger. And after that, I just kind of went, I don't want to write any more poems. So, and that was 1968 and Dad passed away. And I never wrote another poem. But in the meantime, I had a long journey of going to university, on a scholarship, losing the scholarship after Dad died, living on Wheat Bix, And I mean, a lot of university students live on noodles these days. I recommend Wheat nourishing. But I know most students do it tough, except the ones that come from wealthy families. So, whatever. And then, and I did quite a few plays while I was at university. I studied drama. So I acted in plays, but I also wrote little kind of playlets. It was a very political era against the Vietnam War. I've always been very political. Mum and Dad were in the Communist Party, although my mum says she only joined the party because there were some very nice cocktail parties where she could get dressed up. My father was the political one, not Mum. He was the Aboriginal one. Mum was non-Aboriginal. Anyway, so I wrote these kind of, guerrilla theatre events, which, I then made all the costumes and masks with a small group. And then as years went by and I had a child and I went to live in Arnhem Land at one stage, and I was a teacher and I'd always taught with drama because that was my background was a drama teacher. I was only young and I put on plays right across the school with every class, getting the children to write the plays. And I really enjoyed that and found it a very powerful, sorry, it's a very long-winded answer. But,
Oh, no.
But, people do ask me this question.
Yeah.
When one night we put on a play in Gallawinku at Elcho Island, and it was for the senior students, and they'd written the play themselves, and they used to get movies in an outdoor kind of cinema up on a sheet, this is in the late 70s. And they wanted to write a play called Dracula and the Indians. So the girls all made Indian costumes and they got feathered headdresses and beautiful dresses and, and they cut what they thought American Indians looked like. And they're beautiful girls. So they could have worn a sack and they would have looked beautiful. And one of the boys was Count Dracula and I made his costume with a big collar and all this kind of stuff, and the blood coming out of his mouth. And he climbed down the side of the school. There wasn't a theatre at the school. We just did it in the concreted area in front of the canteen. And he climbed down the school and he sucked the blood of all the girls. He couldn't touch the girls because culturally young men cannot touch a young woman unless they're in a special relationship, chosen wife relationship. So, but anyway, and they all died and they went backstage in the dark and they came out in batik costumes. I knew how to do batik. I'd been to Indonesia once, so I learnt batik. Fabulous costumes with great big masks made out of paper mache. So they were ghosts. So it was a skeleton costume with a mask, which was a skull. And they all came out dancing The whole audience of 400 people jumped up screaming and ran out of the school and disappeared. And all that was left were two dogs sitting in the middle. And everyone was standing there on the stage. And I thought at that moment, gee, theatre's powerful.
Wow.
And I think that was at the moment I decided to start writing plays. And I spent, years and years writing plays. And then I turned around to writing poetry and novels in the last 10 years. Yeah.
Mm. Amazing. We have a bit of a long-standing relationship with Elko, not in the arts, in the drama side, but with our Udabadiana social impact lighting collections and things like that. So it's nice to hear different sides of
Right. Yeah. A powerful place.
yeah.
Right.
We make you.
It's amazing. Yeah.
And so we kind of touched on this a little bit of how you got into writing novels, but Benevolence specifically, how did you go about kind of collecting information for that? Did you spend a lot of time out on country by the river and consulting and collaborating?
Yeah, no, really good question. Well, I didn't set out to write that novel. I was employed by Professor Peter Reid, who's the man who started Link Up with Coral Edwards, that links Aboriginal people from the Stolen generation. A marvelous man. I've known him ever since I met him in the Northern Territory, 100 years ago. And he employed me as a senior researcher at Sydney Uni in the history department. I'm not a very good researcher. I'm not an academic. I always lose the reference or whatever. But I'm very curious and I'm very persistent and I'm quite a good communicator with Aboriginal people. So I was able to go out and interview loads of elders. Young people, what I love about Aboriginal people is the young people always go, "Oh no, you can't talk to me. I'll have to go and get Auntie May." I love that extraordinary respect, which is no matter how urbanised the young Aboriginal person is, it's always the same. I know nothing. I'll go and get uncles, So I got to speak to lots and lots of uncles and aunts, and with their permission, of course, and their written permission, we recorded their interviews and put them up on a website called the History of Aboriginal Sydney.
Mm-hmm.
History of Aboriginal Sydney, .au. So I worked on that for 5 years with Peter Reid. And during that time, he said, "Oh, well, you really want to go out west along the Hawkesbury River because that's where your country." And I didn't really know a lot about my family history. It gets buried,
Mm-hmm.
My dad was denied his Aboriginality to keep his job in the fire brigade.
Yeah.
Would have lost his job because it was a government job and Aboriginal people were not allowed to have a New South Wales government job in the 40s and 50s. So Dad would have lost his job. So he just kept quiet. And honestly, he really didn't know much. Every single action was of an Aboriginal man. He could shimmy up trees and cut out grubs and he could, fish and catch animals and hunt. And he was born in him, so
Yeah.
no matter what, he just called himself a bushman or something, but no. But anyway, so when I had all that information, which had been given with permission, it filled in all the stories of my family story, and it just all made sense about how my family had survived along that river, because I had the birth certificates and the death certificates, the ones that existed, which said that, great grandma, worked on an estate and she was a servant, and her husband was a wood splitter when she got a husband. And the children that were, illegitimate children, Aboriginal children just born natural, and how some of them been taken away by the Benevolence Society, and all of it fitted in to, and I was, when we finished, I thought someone in somewhere like London will be looking at this website and go, "Gee, this is great information. I think I'll write a novel." And I thought, I've got to get in first. Even though I'd never really written a particularly successful novel, I'd tried two and I'd never got them published. I was self-published. So I thought, well, I'll give it a go. And that's, and it was a response to The Secret River too by Kate Grenfell. Yeah, I did.
Well, I'm glad you did, because it's super powerful. And I can see how I feel like this is something that every student should read in maybe like year 9 or 10. I feel like it would be a perfect time to get them engaged in this sort of information and really get them thinking outside the box. Because I know how impactful it's been for all of the clients that I've worked with, that I've shared the book with. So I actually took them through the USyd's Aboriginal History Cultural Competency course. So they've all had a look at that website as well. And then at the end, we gifted them all Benevolence and have read them through. And then met up again for a bit of a book club reading about what everyone thought. So there's so many notes that I took away from the book that connected directly to Aboriginal Sydney, you know, even the smallest thing of mentioning a breastplate is something that I would pull out and talk to about
Yeah.
with our clients, because it's like getting them to see how this really was reality, and it's not
Right.
just an artifact, it's not past, it's so recent, and just
Yes.
engaging with that dark side of our history, but you know, learning from it for the better. So yeah, definitely happy that you wrote it. It's such a great
Well,
choice.
you could always lobby the Board of Studies to have it included in the HSC syllabus, because it's not, and yet the secret river is.
Mm,
You know, so that kind of, I find it really irritating, that often the Aboriginal point of view about history, when it's written in a creative form, gets left out. And there's so many wonderful Aboriginal writers now publishing, you know, from the Tara June Winches and the marvelous book, The Song of the Crocodile by Zoe Simpson. There's so many, you know, vibrant books about our history now that there's no excuse
I
for the
agree.
Board of Studies not to include the Indigenous writers. So please lobby them. I've tried, and they just
Yeah.
ignore.
Well, as this is coming out on, this recording will be for Indigenous Literacy Day. I feel like that's a perfect time, and I can probably link something and attach it to this. So it'll be great. Um, so my other question for you was, if there was one key message that you wanted readers to take away from the novel, what would that be?
Um, well, I know the word's been overused, but a kind of a resilience and a determination to defend country and to defend your rights to survive. Um, Too often I find writing about, in a historical novel form, Indigenous people, both by Indigenous writers and non-Indigenous writers, portray Indigenous people as victims. And I work quite closely with Rachel Bin Salah from Magabala, who's a wonderful editor there. Well, she's what's called a commissioning editor. In other words, she buys the books. But she strongly spoke to me about making sure my character was not a victim. And so it required me to rewrite it about 10 times with Magabala. Thanks, Magabala. But as a result, it's a much better book. And the notion that even though she worked as a servant, and I worked as a servant when I was young. I mean, I was washing old ladies' bottoms when I was 14 on the weekends, you know, in order to be able to afford to, you know, buy myself some shoes or something. You know, that these are not dishonorable professions. And certainly I came from a long line of women who've had to be servants or domestic, you know, cooks or sewing people or whatever. And to hold our heads up high, and then the chance to get educated, which in Australia we are remarkably lucky that we do have an opportunity to get educated, can turn your family's life around. I was the first woman in our family to ever go to university. My brother was the first male. So and a lot of the Aboriginal side of the family sort of went, "Well, what would you want to do that for?" What many times have changed?
Yeah, definitely. And I think you can definitely sell for those who haven't read it yet. I'm hoping maybe this recording will inspire some others to put it on their read list during lockdown. But you can definitely tell that kind of resilience, I would say, is as a repeating theme, and something that reading as a First Nations woman, reading about a First Nations woman and seeing that was really great. And a bit of the contrast with her best friends. I won't spoil it too much, but to see how they're kind of um, their paths differ and change. And then I think I'd like to say that I would have that resilience as Murugan
Yes.
has.
Well, I liked writing I won't say too much about Mercy, her best.
Yeah.
I've never had an older sister or even a younger sister. Mind you, I've got a lovely sister-in-law, but and I've always wished I had, you know, some kind of naughty older sister, because I was a bit not so much goody. My mother wouldn't have thought I was goody, but I mean, I was goody in my own mind. But you know, someone who's a bit reckless and wild, and so you know, so I created the character of Mercy, who really doesn't give a damn. You know, just kind of does whatever she wants. She's very naughty.
I like her. I love her attitude. I thought she was just, she reminded me of some of my friends from uni. And and I felt a bit more of like the Morgan side. And then there's like my friends that are like Mercy's.
Oh, good. You know, I'd love to see Mercy in a film, you know.
Yes, that would be great. And then so my last question that I have written down, but I have many more questions, is that I heard you have a new novel in the works. And I was wondering, tell us a little bit about that and maybe when it'd be released.
Oh gosh, that's such a good question, but also it's a terrible really. Look, I don't know. I think even though I'm an old lady now, I'm sort of naive in many ways. I thought, now that this book's been reasonably successful, it's been bought by HarperCollins. It's going to be coming out in both all over United States and UK in July 2022 in hardcover, audible, just it, and with a great big publishing, push behind it. So I might finally make some money. I never make any money at all. Anyway, but I'd be very glad to share that story as a First Nation story. And apparently there's a lot of people interested in colonial history, historical stories written from an Indigenous point of view. Yeah, but the new book, it's called This River of Bones. And it's about the death of the Darling River. Now, I spent some of my youth, when I was a young single mother, on the Darling River with Nyempa people and Gamilaroi people who lived on the Burke Reserve. I didn't live on the reserve. I lived in town in an old house with a few uni students. And but I'd go down the reserve every single day. And my best friend, Auntie Jenny Ebsworth, who's from out your way, she's at Gundenning. She lives out near Mount Druitt. Auntie Jenny's still out there, wonderful person, a wonderful matriarch for the community, part of the Catholic Church's Aboriginal women's kind of a movement out there. And she was such an inspiration. And then years later, I'd always go back to Burke and I visit the river and seeing the terrible destruction of the river due to the cotton farms and the almond farms and, Barnaby Joyce and various other assholes. Excuse me, I have to delete that out.
That's all right.
I just felt passionate about writing something about the river. And that hasn't changed. The river's still dying, even if there's water in it. And so I wrote this novel. And but I found it really quite hard to find a publisher who was interested, despite the success of Benevolence. So an editor I was working with suggested I turned it into a crime novel. So I've got a female protagonist, a bit like a Deborah Mailman character, who's an auntie out in the community who opens up an investigative agency after doing a TAFE 3 certificate online. And she investigates a murder in the town of another young Aboriginal man. But he's been murdered due to his activism about the river.
Mm.
So it's actually an environmental novel, but with crime.
Mm.
And once again, an Aboriginal woman protagonist. But for the first time ever, I made her a lady closer to my own age. I wanted a female protagonist who was celebrate all those wonderful aunties and sisters that I know that do such amazing work for community and are always kind of get ignored. And I thought, they're so funny and sexy and naughty and outrageous, but also great knowledge holders.
Mm.
So I celebrate older Aboriginal women in the novel.
That sounds exciting. I did read a little bit about it in the blurb, and I think the crime element will draw you in, and then it hits you with the environmental element, which will stay with you after you have the novel.
I hope you're right. I won't mention who, but I do have a publisher who's interested. So
that would be great.
Thank you. You work for years on these, so they can take 5 years. And
I feel like it is quite perfect timing. We're at a tipping point, and I think a great realization where the wider community is recognizing the significance and power of First Nations knowledge in connection to the environment, even though it's always been there.
Yes.
I just feel like it's finally coming to the forefront and being noticed as it should be.
Yeah, I hope you're right. Yeah. But, yes, I never said there's an old-fashioned saying which says an artist without politics is a warrior without a spear. If you don't have politics in your art and you just do pretty pictures all the time, then that's I don't really see the point. Our wonderful Aboriginal artists in Darwin. I've just been to Darwin recently to visit my daughter, and in a way, every single one of those paintings, which is about country, is about preservation of country and culture and history. And they have a political side. They tell a story. And I just think I can't write novels or plays or poems that don't have a strong political side to them. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think First Nations just interconnected with being a political activist almost, even if you don't mean to be. It's just always fighting for something. And
Yes, it's the day they do
do like
this.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah. One question off the back of just, I just was wondering, where did you get your earrings from? I feel like you were wearing an Anuku necklace, maybe?
Like earrings.
You know, like,
I've got two that are even bigger, that are really great and really big.
very lovely.
I was wearing them recently, and someone said, "Oh, you got beer coasters on your ears."
I've never heard that one before. We've been going.
Well, they're beautiful too. Did you make them?
These ones, I didn't. These ones are Lamandra ones from Maramali. They're lovely Gomeroi women's weaving group out in Tamworth. And we've done an exhibition with them, and they're my absolutely favourite. The Lamandra in earring form, and it's so fine. Yeah.
Did you send me a link to that?
Yeah, for sure.
No,
Yeah.
they're absolutely beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that was all my questions, and it kind of went exactly how I was hoping. It's just a great yarn, and I feel like hope listeners will take away something, if not read the book at least.
But also, if young people are watching this, I would like to encourage them to empower themselves through both art practice and writing practice, to not feel that, oh no, but that we all have it in us to write or create something that is important. And rather than being constantly consumers of other people's information, write your own truth. Sit down and write a half a page poem, which is about your own existence and how you get through the day. But just encouraging young people to step up and to write and paint and draw and create, make films, the whole thing. It's you.
That I would second that. I feel like I need to give it a go myself.
Us older generation, we're bowing out. We're passing it on to all of you now.
Yeah. And I feel like a lot of the contemporary art forms, or a lot of my friends, are really successfully using social media to get their platforms and grow their platforms and have really important messages, especially on Instagram. There's such a great bunch of First Nations artists, activists, poets, writers, just everything across that platform. And to see my whole feed filled with Black excellence is pretty great.
Fantastic. So just send me an email too about yourself and your own practice and your own, any links I can look at your work, or I'd love to share that information. I'd love to see what you're doing.